The scene is the temple where the scribes and Pharisees had brought unto Jesus a woman taken in adultery. At one point, Jesus addresses the part of the Jewish crowd that gathered who were believers. He says, "If ye continue in my word, then ye are my disciples indeed. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." There were immediate objections from some of those in the crowd. John 8 tells us, beginning with verse 33, they answered him, "We are Abraham's seed, and we never were in bondage to any man. How sayest thou, ye shall be free?" Jesus answered them, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. And the servant abideth not in the house forever, but the Son abideth ever. If the Son therefore shall make you free, ye shall be free indeed." Well, what is freedom? There are freedom celebrations going on all over the nation on the 4th of July. Freedoms we enjoy as a nation ought to be celebrated. We have greater freedoms than any other nation on the earth has enjoyed. But Jesus says that there is a freedom that outshines them all. The free indeed that Jesus talks about is not the misguided notion revealed in people and nations by history. When you are misguided, the path that you think leads to freedom leads to captivity. We have a natural bent towards the misguided path. From infancy, we want things our way. It is an innocent thing in a baby, less so in a young child who wants to do things his way or her way when adults tell them otherwise. There is that age of accountability where they become accountable for their own actions. I didn't know it was wrong. Oh, that's no longer an excuse. We know better, but we don't do better. Well, then there is that great yearning of youth to be free. To be free, to be on your own, to be your own master. Doesn't it sound so bold and exciting? And think about it. If you had the freedom to go anywhere you wanted, if you had the money and your parents didn't stop you, you could take off tomorrow. And where would you go? What would you do? Well, this is exactly the situation confronting the story told about a young man named Robert Deveau. He wanted his freedom. He didn't like country life, even though Twin Oaks, where he lived, was a large plantation in South Carolina. His older brother was stuffy. His father wasn't unkind, but he had some old-fashioned ideas. His mother had died 6 months before his 21st birthday. He was tired of the rules and the restrictions. He kept telling himself, it's always the same old things, no excitement. His older brother John took over the management of the plantation. Robert had his mother's artistic and restless temperament. He wanted to go to Paris to study art. He wanted to go there to be free to paint and to live and to really live. And finally, he couldn't wait any longer. He wanted his inheritance now. So he went to his father and said, give me my inheritance now. And he looked at the world and he said, give me what I want now. He imagined this dream that was finally going to come true. And he was of age. He was old enough to live his own life. You know, a man just has to do what a man has to do, he told his father. Well, the father recognized that his son would eventually leave, and so he turned over the inheritance to his son. So Robert had his freedom. He was 21. What more could anyone ask? At first, when he went to Paris, well, things were going well. He wrote his father that several of his oils had been hung in an art exhibit. But then gradually, the party life began to lure him. He wanted a bigger, nicer place to stay. He bought an expensive car. He was doing what he wanted to do. But soon he found himself faced with restrictions on his freedom. Oh, there are always those simple things like stop signs and red lights that you ought to obey. But you know, he was free. He was free to drive through a red light, but not free to avoid the fines or the accidents that would result. He was free to eat wherever he liked and however much he wanted, but if he ate too much, he wasn't free from the consequences. In the realm of his art, his freedom was limited by his ability or his lack of it. He'd see some beautiful mist rising off the Seine, bright colors of sidewalk cafes under their awnings, and beautiful trees bathed in shimmering light. But he wasn't free to capture on canvas what he saw, because there was a limit to his talent. You see, whatever talent he had was, you might say, held in bondage by his own limitations. Well, he thought he'd just sit at the feet of other artists, study their techniques, and learn to become the best artist he could. He had enough money to do and go wherever he wanted. He bought friends with gifts and became well known for his generosity. And this was the life, he thought. This is great. The inheritance money represented years of hard work, of sacrifice and saving on the part of his parents. But you know what? It was eventually gone. You see, he had tried to satisfy his desires. However, they were only fed, and they were never fulfilled. And that's the way the desires for those things of this world goes. Well, one morning, the young man woke up to realize that his money was gone. All his creditors were hounding him. And finally, his past caught up with him. There was nothing for him to do but to find work somewhere, anywhere, and he found work on a local farm. He was a hired hand. His wages, though, were all spent trying to satisfy what had become a substance abuse problem. He had become hardened, and every part of him was sick of the sight and the smell of the barnyard and the livestock. He hated his surroundings. He hated his work. But most of all, he hated himself. But then somehow, he came to himself. And when he did, memories of home came surging back. Something, the call of God's Spirit in his heart, the early training of his father and his mother, something brought him back to himself. He thought of home. He thought about Christmas. Christmas back home. They had roast turkey and chestnut stuffing, fried chicken, preserves, pecans. And he remembered the look of his father's face. He could feel his father's strong arms around him. Growing up, he had thought his father was just stuffy and old-fashioned. But that night, he crept away from the farm. He was going home. Yeah, you've heard this story before. It's the old story of the prodigal son, just as old as man's sin, but also as new as God's forgiveness for every man who thinks that freedom means the license to do what he pleases. All of us need to know what freedom really is and what it's not. The first truth is that freedom is not simply rebellion or revolution. Every day we hear of politicians and schools, colleges, universities that are like the prodigal son, throwing off all restraints, not accepting the conventions of society as they were, renouncing those old accepted beliefs, and all for just an illusion of freedom. Oh, they may be politically correct. They may be woke. But they've rebelled, and they're not really free. But in the ordinary course of life, each of us has to find for himself that there is more to freedom than just rebelling against the rules. It's also true that freedom is not being without a plan. Oh, we've heard that story of the 6-year-old that announces, "I'm going to run away." Well, it usually ends with a parent who helps them pack, and in some versions they only let them pack what the children own, and that alone is enough to stop them from their journey to run away. Well, the stories, of course, some of them go on, and while they're packing, of course, there are those questions that the parent asks about, well, where are you going to spend the night? Oh, okay. And, and how are you going to eat? Well, and a lot more practical questions, and that usually brings an end to the nonsense. Well, one more on a more adult level. It's like the man who says that he has climbed the ladder of success, only to find out that it was leaning against the wrong wall. Well, you also have the disillusionment that inevitably follows liberty without restraint or without plan. In genuine freedom, there is a plan that comes from the inside of a man. The commercial asks, "What's in your wallet?" And the question that really counts is, "What's in your heart?" For Robert Duveau, his plan ended up trailing off into irresponsibility. The more he did things his way, the less freedom he ended up having. And he was more hemmed in by his poverty. The more he was a slave to bad habits, the more he ran up against the laws of God. And those laws are not set aside for anyone. You see, doing things our way and our bad habits and plans end up entrapping us. We end up with so much debt we can't see our way out. It's my money. No one else's money. I can spend it as I please. The addictions are too strong to overcome. You know, it all started with just a drink, a single cigarette, a little white lie, a single suggestive comment, or a youthful indiscretion. The relationships, though, are broken. The time runs out for us to change the results, and life is spent. The words you said, the lies you told, the money you stole now come back to haunt your conscience. And you stand guilty before God, even if other men don't know about it. You're not free to do anything about it unless you become free indeed. Well, there is a path to freedom, real freedom. And Jesus described it this way: "Whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it." We get freedom by giving ourselves away to Jesus. He tells us to give ourselves to serve him by serving others. What we are is given to Jesus to change us. Our past we give to him. Our future we give to him. Everything. You see, it's all right to say, "I'm a sinner, I've failed." And then give yourself to Jesus to become what he wants you to be, not what anyone else may think. Give yourself to what God has called you to be in Jesus Christ. Michelangelo gave himself to be an artist, but his father wanted him to be a stonecutter. And so at the age of 13, over his father's objection, he left home. But then he was free. Yet he was free and became a bondservant, you might say, to art. There were long hours of work. He gave himself. There was hardship. 2 years, 3 months of grueling work to complete the statue of David. Over 4.5 years to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He was free, yet voluntarily he bound himself to what he was called to be. Long centuries before, God's word to Pharaoh on behalf of his chosen people had been, "Let my people go." And after that, through the long years of wanderings and captivities, through times of obedience and through times of falling away, God never changed his word. Let my people go. Finally, the word came to Jesus. It's no accident that Jesus is so concerned with freedom. That day in Nazareth, for instance, when he stood up in the local synagogue and announced his messiahship, and he said his kingdom would come and it would bring deliverance to the captives. Then he demonstrated that by freeing men that were bound by sin. Finally, his supreme example of freedom, he gave himself completely. He gave his life on the cross. This point he made over and over again. He said, no man takes my life. I lay it down. I have the power to lay it down, and I have the power to take it up again. Yes, Christ was the freest man who ever lived. And yet, here's the paradox. He was free because he had given his life and his love away to the Heavenly Father. Let me tell you that it'll be the best decision you ever make. There is no joy like the joy of sins forgiven. And no burden is greater, though, than that load of unconfessed and unforgiven sin. Isaiah prophesied that Jesus would be a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Yes, but remember, he did that in order that our joy might be full. You know, the picture of Jesus in the Gospels is a joyful and loving Jesus, whom everybody loved, except the cynical, the hard, the hypocrite. He was a guest at a wedding feast in Canaan, you'll remember, because he enjoyed being with others, and he enjoyed fun and fellowship. He was criticized because of the company he kept. He was referred to as a friend of publicans and sinners, even called a winebibber. The humble folk loved him and heard him gladly. And children gathered around him eagerly. You know, children don't go looking for someone who's sober and grumpy and grim. Always Christ's message is that his Father has designed you and me for freedom, and also to have a joy in the Spirit. As one man noted, I counted the word joy 191 times in Scripture, gladness or glad 125 points, and then at that point I gave up counting. God is a God of prayer, but also a God of laughter. He is a God of singing and a God of tears. God is at home with his children and with the play of children. He loves to hear us laugh too. Your joy no man taketh from you. He insisted in John 16:22. And indeed, he cherishes our liberty and our joy so much that if we let him, he will see to it that no one takes away from us that real joy inside. And he stands shoulder to shoulder beside us to battle for our freedom. And in the end, you see, there's only one that we can trust to hold the keys of our personal freedom, and that is Jesus. And once we put those keys in Jesus Christ's hands, we have a surprise waiting for us. You know, some people are afraid that giving Jesus their loyalty will only lead to a long list of do's and don'ts. But that's not the truth. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. The Apostle Paul exalts us in Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. The liberty to do right. Augustine put it this way: Christ's way is love God and do as you please. Well, now, there are people who say, I certainly know folks that do as they please. But you'll notice it says, love God. And as you grow to love God, what you please will change. And that's where the surprise comes in. God gives the inner man a new set of goals and passions. It would simply be bondage if we had to obey God when we didn't want to. It's a delightful freedom when pleasing God is what you want to do. And that is the wonderful way that God works it out for us. Let me conclude with these remarks from Peter Marshall. The story of the prodigal son is the story of every man. And when the sands of the desert grow cold, when the stars go out one by one, when the earth is rolled up like a carpet and thrown over the high balcony of heaven, when our clever sciences have been forgotten, when proud boasts of men have been carried away on the hurricanes of time, this story will still speak to us. Of a boy who lost his way, of a father who freely gave him. It still has the power to soften our hearts and to bring tears to our eyes. It will still point the way to a heart's true home, still unfold to us the love of God. For this story that Jesus told contains the most appealing picture of God ever drawn. The parable contains the heart of the gospel, that God is willing, indeed eager, to forgive sinners like you and me, that the moment we turn around and take our way back home, the Father will come running down the road to meet us. That is the one who alone holds in his hands the keys to our real, true freedom. I like the words of the hymn that says, "Make me a captive, Lord, and then I shall be free."